The summer of 1887 had a mean streak, hot and stubborn as a mule with a burr under its tail. Dust clung to the skin like regret, and in the town of Angel's Rest, the wind carried secrets along with the grit. Folks moved slower come midday, shutters drawn, hats tipped low, and even the horses seemed to stand quieter, as if afraid to stir the heat. Mabel Dunley ran the diner at the edge of Maine, not much more than a leaning shack with 2 tables and a counter, but it was clean, and it served beans hot and coffee strong enough to melt a silver spoon. She'd been there near 10 years, since her husband fell to a mining collapse that left her with nothing but grit and a stubborn streak that matched the land. It was just past high noon when he wandered in, a tall feller with shoulders like a freight wagon and a coat too heavy for the heat. His boots were worn down near to nothing, and the brim of his hat threw his eyes into shadow. Didn't say a word, not at first. Just stood in the doorway, like he weren't sure if he was coming in for a meal or just a moment's mercy from the sun. "You hungry?" Mabel asked, not unkindly, not eager neither. She didn't trust easy, but she didn't turn away the broken. The man nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She set a plate of beans, bread, and the last slice of peach pie from breakfast. He didn't ask for it, didn't ask for nothing. Just sat down, real quiet-like, and ate like a man who hadn't had more than wind and trail dust for days. He finished every crumb, then lifted his gaze. "Thank you," he said, voice low and rough as a dry creek. Mabel nodded, started clearing the plate. "Don't got much pie left, but I can heat up some coffee if you're staying a spell." He hesitated, then reached into his coat. What he placed on the table caught the light. A single gold coin, Chernine, like a drop of sun in that dim little room. Alongside it, folded neat as Sunday linen, was a letter. "Don't open it yet," he said. "Not till I'm gone." Mabel blinked, frown tugged in at her brow. "What's this about?" But the man was already standing, tipping his hat. "Just to thank you, ma'am, for more than the food." And before she could say another word, he was out the door, swallowed by the shimmering heat. Mabel stood there a long moment, hand hovering over the envelope. She didn't recognize the seal, a sun carved into wax, with a single flame licking upward. She didn't open it. Not yet. Outside, the stranger disappeared down the dusty road, leaving nothing but boot prints and questions in his wake. Mabel stared at that gold coin long after the stranger vanished beyond the sycamores. Gold didn't show up often round Angel's Rest, and never with strangers who walked like ghosts and tipped their hats like goodbye was permanent. She finally tucked the envelope and the coin under the flour tin, told herself she'd open the letter after supper, once her hands had stopped shaking. But even as she scrubbed pots and swept dust from a stoop, her mind kept circling back to the way he'd said thank you. Not like a man thanking for pie, but like a man settling an old score. That night, the sky turned the color of burnt apricots, and crickets began their usual sermon in the tall grass beyond town. Mabel poured herself a finger of corn whiskey, just one, and sat by the lamp with the letter. She peeled the seal back slow, careful like it might burn. Inside, the handwriting was clean but firm, a soldier's script, or maybe a preacher's, no wasted curves. "Miss Dunley, you don't know me, but I reckon I know you. My name's Elijah Harrow. 23 years ago, my ma came through Angel's Rest with nothing but a boy on her hip and shame on her heels. She stopped at your diner, said a woman with kind eyes fed her for free, gave her a place to sit where no one stared like she was dirt. She never forgot that day, nor the woman who showed her grace when she was near out of hope." Mabel's throat caught. She remembered a girl, no older than 20, dressed in threadbare gingham and carry-in, a baby with curls and eyes like storm clouds. She'd stayed the afternoon, left with a tin of biscuits and a blanket stitched by Mabel's own mama. She kept reading. "Ma passed last fall. In her final days, she talked about the kindness she found here. Said if I ever saw Angel's Rest, I ought to leave something behind. That coin ain't much, but it's what I've got. And the letter's just to say thank you. You didn't know what you gave her, but it gave me a mama who didn't quit." There was more, but Mabel had to stop. Her eyes, they weren't what they used to be, but that weren't the reason they stung. She read the rest by lanternlight, the crickets keeping time like a gospel chorus. She never saw Elijah Harrow again. But the next morning, she pinned a letter to the diner wall, right next to a faded photo of her own ma. The coin stayed under the flour tin, not out of mistrust, but because it felt safer close. And from then on, Mabel never turned away a hungry soul. Not that she ever had, but now she did it with a quiet smile, thinking of a girl long gone and a man raised on a stranger's kindness. A week passed like molasses in a cold pan. The days baked dry and slow, and each sunset peeled back the gold from the sky just a little more. Angel's Rest kept on like it always had. Horses tied up out front, gossip blowing through like tumbleweeds, and Mabel behind her counter, pouring coffee and serving up pie like the world made sense. But that letter, that gold coin, they haunted her. She started catching herself watching the road more than she ought to. Every time hoofbeats approached, she half expected that tall stranger to reappear, maybe with more words, or maybe with none at all. Then one morning, just after dawn when the earth was still cool and the roosters had barely crowed, two riders appeared out of the east, long shadows leaning ahead of them like they were pushing time forward with every step. They weren't Elijah Harrow. One wore a gray coat and a bandolier too clean for a rancher. The other rode a nervous chestnut and scanned the buildings like he expected trouble hiding behind each board. They pulled up outside the diner and dismounted slow, boots hidden, the dust with that telltale sound of trouble on two legs. Mabel didn't blink. "You serve breakfast this early?" the taller one asked, voice smooth as creek stones. "If you've got coin," Mabel replied, hands never far from the iron skillet on the stove, or the shotgun stashed just beneath it. They took a table. She served eggs and biscuits, poured coffee, and listened. Always listening. "We're looking for someone," the nervous one said around a bite. "Tall feller, gray coat, walks like a man used to carrying guilt." Mabel's heart near stopped, but her face didn't twitch a muscle. "Don't reckon I've seen him," she said calmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "But a lot of folks pass through this town. Most just want a meal, maybe a quiet night." The tall one studied her like he knew she was lying. "We'll be around a few days," he said, "in case your memory improves." They paid, left a silver dollar and the scent of old blood in their wake. Mabel watched them ride off slow, like buzzards circling just out of sight. Later that night, she took the letter out again and reread it under lanternlight. Elijah had thanked her, but he hadn't said what he was running from. And now, Mabel was holding a secret, even if she hadn't meant to. That night, the wind blew strange through Angel's Rest. Not hard, just unsettled, like the land itself was whispering secrets too heavy for daylight. Mabel sat by the stove long after the dinner rush ended, the chairs turned up on tables, and the lantern wick burning low. Her eyes kept drifting to the door. She thought of Elijah Harrow, of the way he'd eaten like it might be his last meal, of the way he hadn't looked back. And now these two, bounty hunters, she reckoned. Or worse, they weren't looking for a reunion. Around midnight, she heard footsteps out back. Quiet, careful, like a man who knew how to make noise disappear. She reached under the counter, her hand curling, round the stock of that old scattergun, not out of fear, but habit. Then came the knock. Not loud, just 3 gentle taps. She opened the door slow, the barrel at her side. Elijah stood there, dust-covered and hollow-eyed, like the road had tried to scrape him clean of flesh and spirit both. "I didn't aim to bring trouble," he said before she could speak. "Didn't know they'd follow." Mabel looked him over. His coat was torn at the shoulder. A fresh bruise bloomed along his jaw. "You're bleeding," she said. "I'll manage. You always this proud. Or just when you're dying." He didn't answer, just sagged a little at the knees. She let him in, bolted the door, and drew the curtain, set water to boil, and fetched the tin box she kept for splinters, burns, and worse. As she cleaned the cut, he winced but stayed silent. "They say you're a killer," she said finally. "Men with tight smiles and polished boots. Came through this morning. Said they're looking for someone carrying guilt." "I ain't a killer," he said. "Not on purpose." She arched a brow. "That's so." He took a breath, slow and shuddering. Rail job out in Nevada. Man came at me with a pickaxe. I shoved back. He slipped, hit his head on a rail tie. Died before I could speak his name. Self-defense. Weren't no jury that cared. He was the boss's nephew. Mabel nodded slow, pouring him coffee. And now they hunt you for blood they already spilled in their minds. I figured if I came here, maybe I could make something right. Don't know why. I just remember my talking about this place like it was holy ground. Mabel studied him. The lines on his face weren't born from evil. They were carved by regret, by running. She'd seen both before. "You got a bedroll?" she asked. He looked surprised. "I'll sleep in the barn. You'll sleep in the pantry. Don't argue. Ain't no law says a man's gotta keep suffering just 'cause he's tired." He managed the ghost of a smile. As he settled down amid sacks of flour and canned peaches, Mabel leaned against the wall outside the pantry door, shotgun still across her lap. She didn't sleep much that night, not with two devils sniffing the trail and one ghost sleeping under her roof. The next morning broke thick with heat, the kind that stuck to your throat and made every breath taste like copper. The sun rose red over the hills, hanging there like a sheriff's badge over a guilty town. Elijah was already gone from the pantry when Mabel woke. She found him out back, sleeves rolled, stacking, would like he owed the world penance for every sin he hadn't committed. "You planning to work off your ghosts?" she asked, pouring 2 mugs of chicory. He didn't look up. "Figure I might try." They drank in silence, the morning birds making more noise than either of them. But peace don't linger long in places like Angel's Rest. Around mid-morning, the two strangers returned. This time, they didn't bother with pleasantries. Walked right through the diner doors like they owned the land beneath their boots. Mabel stepped out from behind the counter, chin up, apron stiff with starch. "Back again?" she asked cool-like. The tall one, fellow with the scar just under his lip, smiled like a blade. "We are. You remember anything?" "I remember folks get mean when they're bored. You want coffee, or you just here to cause trouble?" He took a step forward, leaning close. He was seen. "On the ridge yonder, near the old cattle trail. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Mabel didn't blink. "I've seen plenty of shadows. Ain't tried to arrest one yet." The nervous one fingered his belt buckle. "We know he was here." "Then maybe you ought to be out on the trail instead of both errand a woman serving breakfast." They didn't like that, not one bit. But they also didn't push. Not yet. Just turned, slow and hard, like a storm building behind glass. When they were gone, Elijah came out from behind the henhouse, face drawn. "They're getting close," he said. "I know," Mabel replied. "And if they catch you, they'll string you up before you get a word in edgewise." "I should leave." Mabel turned to him, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "You could. Or you could stop running." He frowned. "Ain't nowhere else to go." "Then maybe it's time to stand. Not just for you, but for her." He froze. "Her, your ma. She found peace here. Gave you the strength to make it this far. Might be time to give something back." He didn't answer, but his jaw tightened, and his gaze went out toward the hills, where the road curled like a sleeping snake. That afternoon, he saddled up a borrowed mule from a livery and rode out toward the ridge. Not to flee. Not this time. He was laying a trap. By sundown, the heat had broken just enough to breathe, and the sky went copper and violet over the hills beyond Angel's Rest. Mabel stood out front of the diner, watching the clouds gather like witnesses to what was coming. Folks had a feeling about things like this. You could hear it in the way dogs barked less, and the breeze moved funny through the cottonwoods. Elijah had taken the high trail, following the dry wash past Widow Stone's old orchard, the place no one visited since the fire. It was quiet up there, save for a hawk crying out every so often, and the shuffle of hooves over brittle grass. He didn't carry a rifle, just a small knife tucked in his boot, and a letter in his coat pocket he'd written that morning, addressed to M. Dunley, Angel's Rest. Down in town, Mabel kept to the front steps, eyes on the road. The 2 bounty men hadn't returned by supper, and that made her uneasy. It meant they were tracking. and if they were half as good as they thought, they'd find that ridge come nightfall. But Elijah, he had the high ground. Out on Hollow Ridge, the stranger waited with his back to the canyon wall. He didn't move, didn't stir, just sat quiet with the moon sliding slow across the sky. He thought of his mama, her hands, calloused from scrubbing laundry, and the way she used to sing low when she thought no one could hear. He thought of Mabel, too, of the coffee, the cornbread, the eyes that didn't flinch when he told the worst of his truths. Then he heard it, the crunch of boots, cautious and slow. 2 sets. One voice, sharp with tension. "He's up here. Told you I saw the fire smoke." They came in guns drawn, but not reckless. The tall one, the talker, stepped ahead, gun raised, finger easy on the trigger. "Evening, Harrow," he called. "I'd say it's time to come with us." Elijah stood slow, hands raised but calm. "I ain't armed, but I ain't running no more." "That's real poetic," the other sneered. "But poetry don't stop bullets. I didn't kill that man. He fell. He came at me first." "You think that matters to folks paying our bills?" "No," Elijah said, voice even. "But it might matter to you." And for a breath, just one, they hesitated. That's when the shot rang out. But it didn't come from them. It came from behind. Down the slope, in the dark near the trail, Mabel stood with a rifle, her late husband's, braced against her shoulder. She'd followed them, quiet as a whisper on a still night. "You boys looking for justice or just a payday?" she said, voice hard as flint. "'Cause if it's the latter, you best ride out. And if it's the former, maybe it's time you listened." The 2 men looked between her and Elijah. The talker's eyes narrowed, jaw working, like he wanted to spit. But he didn't raise his gun again. Not with that rifle aimed square. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," Mabel replied. "You are." After a long, dry silence, the men turned, walked back the way they came, and Elijah sank to his knees, not from injury, but from relief. Come morning, the hills around Angel's Rest lay quiet, and the road carried only birdsong and breeze. The bounty hunters were gone, their tracks wind-worn by dawn. No one asked where they went, and no one missed them neither. Elijah Harrow sat at Mabel's table, hands wrapped round a cup of coffee that tasted like forgiveness. He looked different now, not lighter, exactly, but more grounded, like a man who'd finally laid a burden down and left it behind for the earth to carry. Mabel didn't say much. She never did. But she set a letter down in front of him, folded neat. "I read what you left me," she said. He nodded, eyes low. "Your mama," she continued. "She came through here looking for mercy. I gave her pie and shelter. 'Cause that's what you do when the world forgets someone. Didn't figure I'd be seeing the kindness returned like this." He opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand. "You don't need to say it," she said. "Not now." Later that week, Elijah took to the field behind the diner, built a fence Mabel never asked for, fixed the broken step she kept meaning to replace, and planted a small patch of corn in the rich soil she hadn't touched in years. He never said he was staying. But he didn't leave either. And Mabel, well, she added a new page to the old ledger she kept behind the counter, not for debts, but for names worth remembering. At the top she wrote, "Elijah Harrow, fed, sheltered, defended, paid in full." The gold coin stayed under the flour tin. The letter stayed pinned on the wall. And the story of a hungry stranger who left a letter and a coin became something more. Folks who wandered and tired or lost, Mabel fed him, sat him down. And sometimes, when the light hit just right, she'd point to that letter and say that there's a reminder. Not all who wander are running. Some are just trying to get back to something they lost. And in the corner, Elijah would nod quiet, hands calloused and steady, the past behind him, the heat of summer still heavy, but bearable, because sometimes the road don't lead to riches or revenge, just to a place where someone leaves the door open and says, "Come on in."